We shall commence this module by discussing the various policy perspectives. Economic policies are designed to stabilize the economy whenever recessionary or inflationary pressures destabilize the economy. There are tools of fiscal and monetary policy which are used to influence the economic outcomes. At times, active policies are implemented which target the current economic problem but in the long run may exert adverse effect on the economy, while the passive policies are designed considering the long-term implication of the adopted policy. Policies generally influence the economic variables with lags as the policies are not implemented instantaneously. There is also a choice with the policy makers to design the economic policies according to some fixed rule or at discretion. I repeat, highly discretionary economic policies downgrade the credibility of people, thus prove to be time inconsistent. After studying this module, you shall be able to know the difference between active and passive policies, understand how internal and external policy lags influence the attainment of economic objectives, identify the difference in magnitude of lags in case of fiscal and monetary policy, evaluate the pros and cons of the rule-based policies and discretionary policy, analyze the importance of credibility to overcome time inconsistency problem. Let us now discuss the implementation of active or passive policies, prospective lags in policies, rules versus discretionary policies, and the policy credibility and time inconsistency problem in detail. First, the active policy. The government use monetary and fiscal tools to drive the economy. Monetary policy includes performing open market operations, changing reserve requirement and the interest rate by changing money supply. On the other hand, fiscal policy uses the tools of taxes, transfer payments and government spendings. All of these tools can be controlled actively. The government, if it decides to pursue an expansionary policy, can simply select a tool from the policy toolbox and use it. Active policy includes all those actions by the government that are done in response to the economic conditions. It means that the government chooses to respond to something in the economy by undertaking a specific policy. As the choice of this policy depends upon the existing state of economic problem, therefore, this policy is called as discretionary policy. Active policy allows policy makers to respond to the shifts in a complex economy and drive the economy in the optimal direction. For instance, an excellent policy maker may be able to keep the economy growing steadily without inflation if he or she is given complete control of the macroeconomic policy. Active policy responds swiftly to the shift from optimal as against the natural adjustment which takes too long. However, the role of expectations is very important in getting the desired results of any active policy. Not only this, the active policy has a number of difficulties associated with it, as it relies on the actions and experiences of policy makers and the government, the weaknesses or prejudices of these policymakers can be translated into official economic policy. For instance, some active policies that enables the economy to grow in the short run regardless of the long-term effects are undertaken to serve the interest of some influential class. Similarly, it may be possible for the policy makers to pursue the policies that achieve their selfish ends rather than those that are best for the economy at large. With active policy, policy makers can say one thing but may find incentive to renege on their commitments. There may be benefits to making the public believe that something different is occurring in the economy rather than what actually is occurring. For instance, if the government wants to increase the investment, it could use deception by claiming that it raised the interest rates while not actually doing so. In this scenario, private investors would save more, but investment would remain at the old level or even increases. Thus, it is reasonable to claim that active policy leaves monetary policy and fiscal policy open to not only accidental human error but also to malicious and self-serving acts. Also, for the success of these active policies, accurate forecasting is a prerequisite, otherwise cost may surpass the desired benefits of adopting such policies. Apart from this, the problem of lags make the execution of the active policies all the more difficult. Next, we will understand about passive policy. In contrast to the active policy, which is discretionary, passive policy is based on the policy making by rule. Under this system, macroeconomic policy is conducted according to a predefined set of rules. These rules take into account many macroeconomic variables and dictate the best course of action given these conditions. For instance, a passive policy may follow the rule that in order to stabilize the economy, the interest rate must be dropped 1 point whenever the nominal GDP falls 1%. The passive policy is advantageous as it takes out all those policies which considers the short-term desires of policy makers from the list of possible goals of macroeconomic policy. Instead, the focus of policy makers is simply to carry out the macroeconomic policy aiming to ensure the smooth running of the economy. Policy by rule uses policy makers to implement rather than design macroeconomic policy. The approach of passive policy is based on optimizing the economy in the long run and are less likely to trade short-run prosperity for long-run growth. The passive approach to the policy making is more stable than the discretionary. Now, we will discuss about the lags in the effects of policies. Policy lag means delay in policy making and its implementation, which in turn delays the attainment of ultimate objective for which the policy was made. Policy lags can be categorized as inside lag and outside lag. The three specific inside lags are recognition lag, decision lag, and implementation lag. An important outside lag is impact lag. In an economic system, at first, it takes time to identify that problem exists. This recognition lag is all the way present. In the application of some solution for the encountered problem, there comes decision lag and implementation lag. Policy lags arise because government actions are not instantaneous. The use of any stabilization policy encounters time lag between the onset of an economic problem and the full impact of the policy designed to correct the problem. For instance, for correcting a business cycle contraction, the adopted stabilization policy cannot correct the problem instantly. The use of any stabilization policy, especially the fiscal policy and monetary policy, takes time to work through the system. Policy lags, especially inside lags, are often different for monetary policy than for the fiscal policy. The decision lags as well as the implementation lags are comparatively shorter for the monetary policy as compared to the fiscal policy. This is because the decisions about the monetary policies are taken by the central bank along with a small committee, while the fiscal policy decisions are made involving the ruling party, opposition, and by passing the laws, which takes so much time. Also, monetary policy is implemented because it works through the financial markets, which tend to operate and adjust quickly. Fiscal policy, on the other hand, takes a long implementation lag as it needs to pass through the various bureaucratic hurdles. Once implemented, the output and the aggregate demand tend to change relatively slowly, thereby enlarging the lag. Policy lags can reduce the effectiveness of business cycle stabilization policies and can even destabilize the economy. The goal of stabilization policies is to stabilize the business cycle to counter the contraction and expansions. However, policy lags can actually make stabilization policies destabilizing. That is, they can worsen the ups and downs of the business cycle. Let us now understand policy rules versus discretion. This has always been a topic of debate, that whether the economic policies, especially the monetary policy, be conducted by rules known in advance or by the policy maker's discretion. In the previous section, active and passive policies along with their pros and cons have been discussed. In recent times, modern central banks and monetary authorities have increasingly shed secrecy and mystique to engage in communicating to the public their policy framework and rationale, their goals and why they chose them, and the manner in which they intend to achieve their stated objectives. This reflects highly discretionary policy being in place. The public have shown a preference for a monetary policy that is disciplined by the principles of systematic conduct, so that the temptation of higher inflation can be resisted, accountability and credibility can be earned, and policy uncertainty among market participants can be reduced. This reveals a conscious effort to mitigate the problem of dynamic inconsistency to some kind of pre-commitment to a policy rule. Rule-based economic and monetary policy work efficiently under a given set of conditions. In real world, economic conditions are not static but purely dynamic. So, a given rule which works in one set of conditions may not work that much effectively in another. One monetary policy rule is better than the another only if it results in better economic performance according to some criteria such as inflation or the variability of inflation and output. Neither theory nor evidence points convincingly to any of the numerous competing models as superior in explaining the interactions of nominal and real variables as occurs in the actual practice. The relevance of expectations of the future and events of the past to the current decision gives the modern day rules a dynamic feature. Changes in the preferences or technology makes the decision rules stochastic. The rules pertain to the whole economy, not to an individual sector, and this makes them general equilibrium rule. There have been many simple and complex rules like Taylor rule, McCullum rules which have guided the policies. Simple policy rules work well. Their performance is surprisingly close to that of fully operational policies and more robust than the complex rules across a variety of models. Although policy rules can be written down algebraically, they will probably be more useful as guidelines than as the mechanical formula for policy makers to follow exactly, at least for the near future. The advantage with rule-based policies is that they promote the transparency and brings in certainty in the policy environment. Rules that have optimal properties help to deal with the uncertainty inherent in the monetary policy process, uncertainty about the current state of the economy and about where the economy would be going with no change in the policy rate. More generally, policy tools that are based on rules leave less room for policy error. Moreover, once in place, they act as an effective pre-commitment device. A rule-based approach requires a very high degree of confidence that the predefined variables would always correctly perform as intended without noise. This is difficult to achieve for inflation targeting, much more so for identifying the financial instability. In fact, the adoption of a purely rule-based framework focusing on a macroeconomic indicator has faced several drawbacks, including, for instance, the inability to face unexpected structural changes. A discretionary framework also comes to the rescue to addresses this issue by allowing the policy makers to actively learn from observing the interaction of relevant stakeholders. Flexibility and adaptability of discretion have some cost associated as they involve limited predictability of decisions, and they come along with an incentive for the policy makers to postpone backfiring decisions, particularly if they are subject to some form of political pressure, including the pressure of the public opinion. Thus, rules would be the everyday framework while discretion would represent an extreme resort. Provided that the two are extremes and there is a trade-off between ex ante efficiency of discretion and ex post efficiency of rules, hybrid regimes of constrained discretion will serve the objective of monetary policy. This hybrid setting can put more emphasis on rules and changing the discretion as and when required. In order to mitigate the possible dangers generated by discretion, central bank may opt for a clearly stated and transparent and accountable decision making process. Further, we analyze the importance of credibility to overcome time inconsistency problem. Time consistent policy is a policy that will be sustained as circumstances change over time. These policies will be purely rule based. If the authorities adhere to a policy rule, it may require pursuing a policy at a particular point in time that is not optimal at that time. In contrast, Policy that is time inconsistent will be reversed in the future due to the predictable developments over time. Time consistency is easier to understand in terms of its opposite concept of time inconsistency. Time inconsistency refers to the situation in which some agent, planner or objective maximizers must make a choice about an action or decision in some future plan, and in which what is optimal initially is no longer optimal at a later date. This change in what is optimal occurs despite the fact that nothing new has happened and no physical circumstances change, except that decisions of the past are locked in place. It means this problem arises when a decision maker, especially a policy maker, prefers one policy in advance but a different one when the time to implement arrives. Knowing this, others will not find the commitment to the first policy credible. This problem is encountered when the policy makers devise some policy, for instance a monetary expansion, with the focus on raising the growth, but when the actual policy is implemented, expectations change and the resulting monetary expansion results only in inflation while the original goal gets defeated. Thus, there can be many situations where monetary or fiscal authorities might announce some policy change and do not implement it at the later date. But continuously reneging on its pre-commitments may lead to falling credibility for the policies of the government, and these policies may not be able to influence the economic outcomes at the time of crisis when they are actually implemented for the welfare of the economy. From an economic perspective, the issue of time consistency emphasizes the problem of predictably changing the incentives over time. There are two approaches that can be adopted to achieve the time consistency in government policy. First, to limit policy to rules that the government will have an incentive to pursue in all the normal future circumstances. And second is to develop the capacity for commitment or raising the credibility to a policy path. A commitment mechanism is a means for removing the risk of opportunistic policy in particular contingencies. Commitment mechanisms are closely related to more general factors than enhanced policy credibility. There can be many actions that may raise the credibility or strengthen the commitment of economic policies of the government. For instance, integration into the world economy can strengthen the commitment to policies that foster the private investment. A government can enter into agreements with other governments or international institutions to make deviations from prudent trade and macroeconomic policy more difficult for itself. If a country enters into bilateral agreements with other countries, it raises the government commitment to free trade. Just as countries, domestic institutions can also foster policy commitments. A valued reputation for pursuing the particular type of policies can also serve as an assurance that such policy will be pursued consistently despite adverse short-term incentives. Along with policy commitment, policy credibility has emerged as an important recent development in both the theory and practice of macroeconomic policy. From a theoretical perspective, new analysis recognize that government policy making responds to the incentives and constraints. Thus, the structure of government incentives and constraints affect the policy choices. Experience has also shown that similar policies can produce different outcomes depending on the extent to which economic agents believe that the given policy will be continued. Thus, recognizing the economic agents' likely assessment of a proposed policy has become an important issue for policy makers. While full commitment to a policy stance is not feasible in the real world, economics can provide alternative ways to limit the discretion and tie the hands of policy makers with rule-based policies, thereby yielding better economic outcomes. Time inconsistency problems are inherent in the economic policy, and these cannot be eliminated by making the process of policy making independent. Time consistent policy will remain a problem for the government and the central bank because current and future policy makers will not conduct policy in a systematic manner without credible commitments to explicit rules. Wide empirical evidence exists to support the view that limiting discretionary behavior yields better economic outcomes over the long run. In the Keynesian framework, discretionary monetary policy is essential to offset the output fluctuations, while the monetarist proposes a tight and fixed rule to ensure the price stability. However, the time consistency literature shows that discretion-based solutions would be the first best strategy in terms of raising the agent's utility, but they are not time consistent. In fact, strategic responses of rational, utility maximizing agents lead to an ex post suboptimal arrangements, but rules ensure that in the long run at least a second best is achieved. Let us now summarize what we have learned in this module. First, the monetary as well as fiscal tools are available to the economic policy makers to drive the economy in the desired direction. Second, active policy sets to target the economic variables directly without waiting for the slow natural mechanism to work at its own to stabilize the economy. Third, passive policy is worked out with due consideration being given to the long-term sustainability of the policy chosen. Fourth, as the policies are neither adopted nor implemented instantaneously, there are various lags with which the economic policies are characterized. There are recognition lag, decision making lag, implementation lag, impact lag, etc. Fifth, there is a long-standing, still unsettled questions of rules versus discretion in the implementation of economic policies. Rule-based policies raise the credibility, transparency and stability in the economy. Discretionary policy, on the other hand, leads to ex post optimal as it is based on the prevailing economic conditions in the economy. Sixth, time consistency says the policies are sustained even though the circumstances change over time. This needs to be enhanced by promoting the rule-based policies along with raising the credibility in the policy decisions.